So I was made to understand this morning that if people are walking by outside and making noise, you can't hear me very well in the back. If at any point you're not hearing me, let me know and I will do some adjustments, okay? It's my pleasure to be here with you again and to follow up with part 2 now of this 3-part discussion of lament in Scripture. Psalms, Genesis 22, one passage we're looking at tonight. Tomorrow morning, the whole book of Job, mostly God's speeches from the whirlwind. But that'll be a large project. So the passage that was read is my own very literal translation of Genesis 22 because many translations paraphrase, and I want to focus on exactly what the text says, and I'm going to draw on what the text says along the way. So this will be a different kind of a talk. I'm just looking at one passage and asking a simple question about it, though the answer is not simple. And so I had a PowerPoint that went with this morning's talk, and I have a good PowerPoint with tomorrow's talk. I don't have much PowerPoint with this talk, just a little bit of biblical text to project and a couple images. The story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22, verses 1 to 11, goes by different names. In the Christian tradition, we sometimes call it the sacrifice of Isaac, though it's more properly called the near sacrifice of Isaac, because he isn't actually sacrificed. In the Jewish tradition, it's known as the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzhak, which is from the word akedah, which means to bind. The verb akad occurs in verse 9. We're told that Abraham bound his son and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And verse 10 elongates the action as it continues. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and he took the knife to slaughter his son. Whatever we call it, the near sacrifice or the binding of Isaac, this is surely one of the most troubling texts in the Bible. Of course, Isaac doesn't die. God stops him from following through. And certainly lots of worse things happen in the Bible. You know, the slaughter of entire cities at God's command, and that you can talk to Gordon Maddies about because he's written a commentary on Joshua. But this text is troubling to me particularly because Abraham's actions are often used as a shining example of what it means to obey God or to have genuine faith. In particular, this story is used to make the point that we shouldn't let anything or anyone get in the way of our commitment to God. We should be willing to give up anything or anyone for God. After all, the angel from heaven, speaking on behalf of God, announces in verse 12, "Now I know you're a God-fearer, since you've not withheld your son, your only one, from me." And most translations will say, "Now I know you fear God." If you know Hebrew, Hebrew has these consonants and little dots which signify vowels. And the dots in this case on the verb to fear means fearer, God-fearer. Not one who fears God, but God-fearer. And that particular pointing of the Hebrew word only occurs 5 times in the Old Testament. This is one of those 5 times. Pretty unusual. So I rendered it God-fearer. Does this mean that if we genuinely fear or reverence God, we should be ready to kill our children, to sacrifice them to God if we think God requires it? And most of us would say, no. Am I right? I hope so, okay? If I ever heard a voice, internal or external, telling me to sacrifice my son to prove my faithfulness to God, I certainly would not immediately anyway, without further deliberation and questioning, comply, as Abraham seems to have done. Minimally, I'd question this voice. And if I came to believe it was undeniably coming from outside of myself, I would wonder, who is speaking? One of my students, who's a pastor, told me that if he ever was convinced that this was God speaking, or that if he heard a voice saying this, he would respond, "Get thee behind me, Satan." That's a pastor, so I'm quoting a pastor here. If somehow I became convinced it was actually God talking to me, I would say initially, "No, Lord, this isn't right. You can't require this of me. This is wrong." If through an extended discussion with God over the matter, I somehow became convinced that God really required this of me, I have no idea what I would do then. I'd probably keep on raising my questions and my objections. But I certainly would not blindly and silently move to obey, as Abraham did. So for many years now, I have wondered why Abraham did not follow the lead of the psalmists in their lament prayers and question God, raise objections and challenge God. As we saw in the session this morning, fully 1/3 of the Psalms are laments. These Psalms are abrasive prayers which honestly voice complaint to God and ask for redress. And we saw that even Jesus himself prayed laments in the garden and on the cross. Take this cup from me. Why have you abandoned me? So why didn't Abraham say, like the psalmist and Jesus, my God, why have you abandoned me? That would be a pretty good response if you were told to kill your son. Or like Jesus in the garden, take this cup from me. Interestingly, just 4 chapters earlier in Genesis 18, Abraham does challenge God when he thinks that God might destroy the city of Sodom where his nephew Lot is living. Abraham boldly objects to this very idea. Will you indeed sweep away the innocent with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 innocent within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 innocent who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing. Naughty, naughty God, to slay the innocent with the wicked, so the innocent fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right? He's telling God what to do, calling God to account to his own moral standards, if you will. Like the psalmists of old, or like Moses, who intercedes for Israel at the golden calf, after God tells him he's going to destroy Israel, Moses gets God to avert destruction. Abraham, like Moses, like the psalmist, laments the destruction of Sodom and intercedes on behalf of his nephew and family. So in Genesis 18, Abraham joins the chorus of voices from the ragged edge, and his prayer is taken seriously by God. Just as with Moses at the golden calf, God accepts every request Abraham makes, even to save the city, for the sake of 10 innocent people. And when Abraham doesn't ask for anything more, God sends angels to rescue Lot and his family anyway, despite the fact that Abraham never even thought to ask for that. But when it comes to his own son, whom he is commanded himself to kill, Abraham is strangely silent. God says to Abraham, take, please, your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you. And Abraham says nothing in response. But we're told he gets up early the next morning and sets out on the fateful journey. He doesn't say something like, far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the innocent, that is Isaac, with the wicked. Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right? No. In the entire story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, 19 verses, Abraham is recorded as saying only 2 words to God. It's actually the same word, which he says twice, once at the start of the story and once toward the end. That word is hineni. Now, hine is the word behold in Hebrew, or look, or yo, or hear. It's a kind of getting attention-grabbing word. And the e on the end means me. So it literally means behold me. Yo, here I am. That's what the usual translation. Here I am. I'm ready. I'm waiting. I'm listening. A good modern translation, if you're living in New York City, is yo. That'd be a good modern equivalent to that. I'm here. Yep. What's it? What's up? Or maybe what's up would be a good translation sometime. That's all he says to God. And that near silence of Abraham is sometimes taken to be part of what Genesis 22 is teaching. More than once, I have heard this story used in the church to encourage people of faith to simply accept their circumstances as God's will without questioning as the right and faithful thing to do, no matter how difficult it is. I don't think a lot of theologians use it that way, but I've heard it being used that way. Well, I am not able to endorse that use of the story. Indeed, without signaling it in so many words, I've just given 3 reasons why I've come to question the exemplary character of Abraham in Genesis 22. The first is that I personally would never rush to obey such a voice, even if I thought it was God, without seriously questioning it first. Yet Abraham goes to obey in silence. Second, we have the Lament Psalms, which provides us with model modes of speech for addressing God honestly with our suffering, for asking for help in situations of need that we find intolerable. Yet Abraham does not intercede for his own son. And third, Abraham himself engaged in this kind of questioning just 4 chapters earlier in Genesis 18, but here he falls silent. So what is going on in Genesis 22? That's my question. That's the question I'm trying to answer tonight. What is going on in Genesis 22? This evening I want to explore with you, in light of my discomfort with Abraham's loss of voice in Genesis 22, perhaps your discomfort too, whether this is just my or our discomfort, or whether the text itself might give us some clues for beginning to doubt that Abraham is really a model for us to follow here. It is all too easy to object to Abraham's response to God from the outside. I'm interested to see if an insider's perspective, which follows the lead of this text, especially when read in the context of the Abraham story as a whole, might give us an angle of vision, maybe a place to stand from which we could critique and question Abraham. So let's start by taking a close look at the text itself. Let me start with evidence internal to the story of the Akedah for signs that not all is right with Abraham or with Isaac for that matter. And the first clue that something unusual is going on in this chapter is that it is God, Elohim, and not Yahweh, who speaks to Abraham. So I've done a study, and every single other time God speaks to Abraham, in Genesis 12 twice, in Genesis 13, 3 times in Genesis 15, once in Genesis 17, and about 5 times in Genesis 18. Every other time God speaks to Abraham, the narrator says, and Yahweh spoke to Abraham. But here it's Elohim. So an attentive reader will notice a deviation from the pattern. And while we don't know for certain what the purpose of the deviation is, the effect is striking. To be more precise, the name used in Genesis 22 verse 1 is not simply Elohim, it's Ha-Elohim, the God. It has a definite article on it. Ha-Elohim could be translated the gods. It is in some other places. I think here it means the one God because there's a singular verb with it. The God tested, that's a singular verb, Abraham. One biblical scholar suggests we translate verse 1 as, now after these things, the deity tested Abraham. So I can't be sure of the reason for the switch from Yahweh to Ha-Elohim in Genesis 22 verse 1. It occurs also in verses 3 and 9. But here's my hunch. My hunch is we're being put on notice that the issue at stake is whether Abraham's God is just a generic deity or the one known as Yahweh, the God of the covenant, whose distinctive character Abraham needs to come to understand. Interestingly, while it's Ha-Elohim who commands a sacrifice of Isaac, the sacrifice is stopped by a messenger or angel from Yahweh, who speaks in Yahweh's name. And the name Yahweh comes to be associated with the name of the place. We popularly call it Jehovah Jireh. Yahweh will see, or Yahweh will provide. So maybe the narrator is signaling us that this instruction to sacrifice Isaac's son couldn't really be what Yahweh wants. That still leaves a nagging question. Why does God, under any name, ask Abraham to do such a thing? Let's go and try to answer that later on. For now, let me turn to how Abraham relates to his son Isaac within the story at various points. First of all, there is Abraham's ominous silence and the almost methodical preparation for obeying God's command, which portrays the initial mood of the story and suggests Abraham's interior state. I can't get it to move. Let me see what's going on. My screen is frozen. So we can skip the PowerPoint if you want. Let's see if I'm going to unplug it. Just plug it back in. See if that does it. Okay. Because you need some visuals, right? Yeah. Okay. Something is happening here. Ha-Elohim is at work. Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. That looks really weird, doesn't it? Okay. Try one more time. Okay, that's good enough. So according to verse 3, Abraham rose early. He saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young men or his servants and his son Isaac. That's 3 verbs 3 actions of Abraham, then comes Isaac. Then come 3 more verbs. Abraham cut the wood for the offering, he arose and he went. These last 2 verbs, to get up and go, are often translated as one in most Bibles, but I think it's important that what you have here is a symmetry. Isaac is surrounded on either side by 3 silent actions of his father. But no word is spoken, no explanation is given, not to the servants, not to Isaac. And while Abraham is active, busily making preparations, Isaac is passive, the subject of no verbs. Now, on the surface, Abraham's preparation for the sacrifice seems methodical. He did quite a lot of things there, right? But his methodical preparation is belied by the strange sequence of the 2nd and the 4th verbs. Anybody ever had a donkey? Do you saddle a donkey before you cut wood? No, donkeys are not very patient animals. You would normally cut the wood first, then get the servants, then go saddle the donkey last and get moving. So perhaps Abram is not thinking straight. But then who would be in this situation? And then he rose early. Why did he rise early? Did he intentionally not want to deal with his wife, Sarah? Where are you going? She might ask. Oh, to sacrifice our son. What, are you crazy? Maybe he didn't want to have to explain himself to anyone, especially not her. Or maybe he just never decided anything. He just couldn't sleep. He was awake all night. So he acted by rote, shell-shocked, putting one foot in front of the other, going through the actions with a sense of inevitability. Maybe. Then the narrative jumps ahead 3 days to when Abraham sees the mountain in verse 4. Nothing is mentioned as having happened during those 3 days. Presumably they were traveling toward Moriah, the place God told him. Did anybody speak in the 3 days? Judging by Abraham's silent preparations in verse 3, we may surmise that talk was pretty limited, maybe just what was necessary to stop, eat, break camp. I doubt there would have been explanations of what was happening. What do you think Abraham was thinking during those 3 days? What was Isaac thinking? We're not told. In a very famous study of this passage by Eric Auerbach called Mimesis, Auerbach says the narrative is fraught with background, but very little is in the foreground. There's this empty space that's left to the imagination of the reader to fill in. I imagine that Abraham was tortured inside, but I don't know. Then there is the poignant moment in verses 7 and 8 when Abraham and Isaac leave the servants. According to the end of verse 6, the 2 of them went together or walked together. The Hebrew is vayalchu yachdav. And as they walk, there's a touching conversation between father and son. My father, says Isaac. Hineni, my son. That's the same response he made when God called him in verse 1. Same response he'll make when the angel calls him in verse 11. It signifies he's ready to listen, ready to act. Having got Abraham's attention, Isaac then comments to his father that they have the fire, which Abraham is carrying, and the wood, which Isaac is carrying. He omits mention of the knife, which the narrator says was in Abraham's hand. But then Isaac asks, somewhat tentatively or quizzically, I imagine, where is the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham's answer, which is usually taken to express his faith, is actually ambiguous. God will see to the sheep for a burnt offering, my son. Now, if my son was meant to be what we call a vocative of address, that you're my son, I'm talking to you, it would better have come at the beginning of the sentence. My son, God will see to the sheep for the burnt offering, and there are some translations that shift it to the beginning, just as they shift the saddling of the donkey to the end of the actions, because it's more logical. But let's follow what this text says. In its present position at the end of the sentence, my son is ambiguous. It could be a vocative of address, or it could be in apposition to the sheep for a burnt offering. We had a series of words in apposition at the beginning. Take your son, your only one, Isaac. That's apposition, all referring to the same thing. And if we take my son this way, it would mean that Isaac is equivalent to the sheep for the burnt offering. God will see to the sheep for the burnt offering. That is my son. Now, did the narrator intend us to be ambiguous like this? I think so. Is it meant to portray sort of what we'd call a Freudian slip on Abraham's part? Perhaps. Now, we don't know what Isaac thought of the answer. All we're told is that just as at the end of verse 6, so at the end of verse 8, the 2 of them went together. Vayelchu yachdav. This inclusio brackets a tender, touching, though ambiguous conversation between father and son, the only conversation between them recorded in the chapter. Both before and after the conversation, the two of them went together. Vayelchu yachdav. But perhaps the most important datum within Genesis 22 that supports us questioning Abraham's response is that Isaac is missing at the end of the story. This is not the right slide. Okay, this is the right slide. In verse 5, Abraham tells the servants that he and the boy will go up the mountain to worship, and we will return to you. Yet the narrator tells us in verse 19 that Abraham returned to his servants. Isaac is conspicuously absent. Abraham's son is not recorded as returning with him down the mountain, and this is a very well-crafted narrative in which every detail matters. Now, back in Genesis 11, at the start of the Abraham story, we're told that Terah, that's Abraham's father, took Abraham and Lot and Sarai, and they went together, vayelchu yachdav, same phrase, from the land of the Chaldeans to Haran. And then in Genesis 22, 6 and 8, Abraham and Isaac went together, vayelchu yachdav, up the mountain. But when we come to the last verse of the Akedah, verse 19, after noting that Abraham returned to his servants and omitting mention of Isaac, the narrator says that they, Abraham and the servants, arose and went together, vayelchu yachdav, to Beersheba. Abraham went, he journeyed, he walked together with others, but no longer with his family, no longer with his son. There's another clue that something is going on strange in the story, namely the way that Isaac is described in verse 2. He's described as your son, your only one. Yet didn't Abraham have two sons, Ishmael and Isaac? But Ishmael had been sent away in chapter 21. So when God refers to Isaac as your son, your only one, this may mean, I think in context, your only remaining son. You only got one left. One's gone already. However, the full phrase that describes Isaac is your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. So maybe Abraham's love for Isaac is being tested, but perhaps not in the way we usually think of it. There's certainly a test going on in Genesis 22. I see this slide is out of order. There you go. After these things, God tested Abraham. But what exactly is being tested? And why is it being tested? So here we need to consider the function of the Akedah story in the context of the larger Abraham story. And one common way of reading the Abraham story is to follow the narrative arc of promise, delay, and fulfillment, especially the promise about Abraham's descendants, through whom his line would continue, by whom the nations would be blessed. This narrative arc moves through various articulations of the promise, starting in chapter 12, but there's so many I couldn't list them all for you. Then there is Sarai's barrenness, first mentioned in chapter 11. Then the attempt to produce an heir through Hagar, since Sarah can't have children, that's Genesis 16. Then God specifies the heir will in fact come through Sarah in chapter 17, followed by a prediction in chapter 18 that it's going to happen within a year. It's going to happen quickly. So this narrative arc of promise, delay, fulfillment is how many people read the Abraham story. Interestingly, this narrative arc reaches culmination in Genesis 21 when Isaac is born. That's prior to the Akedah. So if that's the narrative arc of the story, the question arises, why do we need Genesis 22? What is its function in the narrative? It's already reached its culmination. The line will continue. And the traditional interpretation, which is based on the first speech the angel of Yahweh makes, is that Abraham is being tested for his willingness to give up the very child of promise, the one through whom the future blessing would come. In other words, this is a test of Abraham's wholehearted commitment to God, placing this commitment above every earthly value, even above God's promise of an heir. And here we may compare the two parallel leave-takings to which Abraham is called. One in the first chapter of this Abraham story, Genesis 12, where he's called to leave his home and his family and go to a land God will show him. and the other in chapter 22, where he's called to sacrifice his son. In one case, he's called to break with his past. In another case, he's called to relinquish his future. This is a very common interpretation in commentaries of the Genesis of the Abraham story. And it's a plausible reading. When Israel was tested in the wilderness, and that verb is used a few times in the book of Numbers and Exodus, the point of the test was to prove their commitment to God, prove their trust in God. And the word prove has here the meaning of bringing out and realizing something that is potential. Prove it in practice. The potential must have been there, but it might be latent. And the stringent situation of testing can force the person being tested to rise to the occasion and show their mettle, so to speak. So is Abraham being tested to see if he would be willing to give up his son and his future out of commitment to God? Is he being tested on just how committed he is to God? Very common interpretation. There are two problems with this interpretation. Let me just go back here. The first problem is, okay, there. I had a visual, but it's not showing up. Don't worry about it. I had a good visual, too. It's the one from Rembrandt, right? There's this picture of Rembrandt that has Abraham with his knife, and he's covering Isaac's face with his hands because he can't look at Isaac's face, and the angel is coming down, the knife is falling out of his hand. It's a very vivid image. I wish I could show that right now, but I can't without fiddling with the computer, so I won't do that. The first problem with thinking that Abraham is being tested for his commitment to God over against his commitment to Isaac is that this involves showing your commitment to God by being willing to kill your son. Now, how can that be actually a model for commitment? It works as a model only if we abstract from the actual particularity of the text to some general axiom about the need for wholehearted obedience to God, which we all believe and which the Bible teaches, but we don't need this text to teach that. It's a strange way to teach that point. Kill your own son to prove your commitment to God? Likewise, the standard Christian typological interpretation of the Akedah falters on the disanalogy between God offering his son for our salvation. That's usually thought to be the analogy, right? But in Orthodox theology, God offering his son for our salvation is the same as God's self-giving. That's a disanalogy with Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac, who is a person over which he does not on any ethical account have legitimate absolute power. I could see Abraham being asked to make a personal sacrifice for God, but not being asked to sacrifice someone else. Those are two very different things. Again, commentaries love to say Abraham is being asked to make a supreme self-sacrifice. No, he's asked to kill somebody else. That's not quite the same thing. So that's a problem. There's another problem with the traditional reading. Namely, it is unclear why this kind of test would be needed at all. Because the Abraham story gives absolutely no evidence of Abraham's special attachment to Isaac, such that giving him up would prove his commitment to God. The reverse is actually easier to show from the Abraham story. He seems to be attached to Ishmael. That's very clear from chapter 17. When God tells Abraham that it's Isaac, not Ishmael, through whom the covenant will come and be passed on, Abraham pleads with God not to forget Ishmael. And God says, I won't forget him, but it's Isaac. I'm going to have the covenant come through. In fact, the account of what happens in Genesis 20, that's just 2 chapters earlier, suggests that Abraham is not particularly tied to the promise of descendants at all. He doesn't care about his descendants. Or maybe it's that he's so attached to Ishmael that he just doesn't care about a replacement son. Remember that Abraham had passed Sarah, his wife, off as his sister in Egypt back in chapter 12 because out of fear that people would kill him because she's still beautiful at 90 years old or whatever. That's great, to be beautiful at that age. And Pharaoh took her into his harem, and then that had to be resolved and negotiated. Abraham does this again in chapter 20. He passes off his wife as his sister in Gerar, and the king of Gerar takes her into his harem. But note this. Note where chapter 20 comes. After God announced in chapter 17 that the covenant heir would be born through Sarah, and after chapter 18 where God predicted this would happen within a year, still Abraham passes her off as his sister, and she's taken into the harem of a foreign king. Does he not care that he might lose her? Does he not care that the promised heir comes through Sarah? So don't tell me that Abraham is attached to Isaac and needs to be tested about this. He cares nothing for Isaac. Given then that it isn't clear that he's attached to Isaac, could it be that Abraham is being given a chance in chapter 22 to maybe prove he actually loves his son? And what would be the evidence for that love? I suggest Abraham would prove his love for Isaac by speaking out and protesting God's command to sacrifice him. Indeed, speaking out on behalf of Isaac might actually serve to extend and deepen Abraham's incipient love for his son, because testing often brings to the surface and makes actual what's only potential. Maybe he had some kind of concern for him, and if he thought that he was to kill him, maybe he'd start to care about him. So it's significant that when the phrase, your son, your only son, is repeated in Genesis 12, when the angel speaks from heaven, and then in Genesis 16, when the angel speaks a second time from heaven, we find a significant difference in the phrasing. The phrasing starts, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. When we get to the later verses, it says, now I know that you are a God-fearer because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. What happened to who you love? These verses affirm Abraham's fear of God, or Abraham's obedience to the divine word, in that he's not withheld his son, his only one. But given that he's just attempted to sacrifice Isaac, I think it makes sense that this God-fearing obedience does not qualify as love for Isaac. So the angel leaves out that phrase. You're willing to sacrifice your only one, but not who you love, because you wouldn't sacrifice him if you loved him. So I think we need to rethink what Yahweh means when he says through the angel, now I know you're a God-fearer, since you've not withheld your son, your only one, from me. This statement describes what was discovered through the testing. That's what I figured out now, says God. But it's a logical fallacy to infer that was the purpose of the test, especially if we have reason to believe otherwise. Let me give you an example. I may say to a student after a test, now I know you're a D student. That doesn't mean that was the purpose of the text. I hope the student would have studied and become an A student. But now I know you're a D student. That doesn't mean that's what Abraham was being tested for. So with this in mind, I'm going to suggest that Abraham was not being tested for his blind, unquestioning obedience. That's not something God wants. But rather for his discernment of God's character. I agree, he was being tested for his trust in God, but genuine trust is not equivalent to blind faith, to do anything a voice from heaven tells you. That can lead you to do terrorist bombings and suicide bombings. Rather, trust in God requires knowledge or discernment of what sort of God this is. And here now it's important to note that beside the narrative arc of the promise of descendants, there is another narrative arc discernible in the Abraham story. The narrative arc of the promise of descendants is culminating in Genesis 21, but this other narrative arc culminates in Genesis 22, and that's the arc of Abraham's growing relationship to God. That's a very important narrative arc because the Abraham story is about the genesis of a new relationship, formalized as a covenant in Genesis 15 and 17, between a God whom later scripture will distinguish radically from the gods of the nations, and a man with no prior knowledge of this God. Taking as our cue the various divine speeches addressed to Abraham between Genesis 12 and 22, and just note, God never speaks to Abraham after Genesis 22, I think we can note the ups and downs of Abraham's verbal responses to God on each occasion, because these responses exhibit a growing and then a declining degree of intimacy and confidence in the divine-human relationship. God speaks to Abraham twice in Genesis 12, though Abraham is not recorded as saying anything. Once in Genesis 13, again, Abraham is not recorded as saying anything. The first time Abraham responds verbally is Genesis 15. In that chapter, God speaks multiple times. Initially, God promises an heir, and then makes a promise about land. Both times, Abraham responds with questions honestly expressing his doubts about, how am I going to have an heir? I have no children. How do I know I'm going to get this land? And in both cases, God takes his question seriously and responds appropriately to bolster Abraham's faith. God speaks again in Genesis 17 about the covenant and circumcision and the birth of Isaac through Sarah. In all this, Abraham speaks only once, asking God not to forget Ishmael, which God agrees to do, while reiterating his covenant with Isaac. At the beginning of Genesis 18, when three men, we're told, visit Abram and Sarah, there's some recorded speech from Yahweh, who is distinguished as one of the three men, the others being angels. And he talks about Sarah's giving birth. No speech of Abraham is reported, but Sarah speaks once in reply, and to deny that she laughed, to which God responds, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." God seems to be really interested in his human partners talking, and he responds nicely to them. Then comes the extended dialogue between God and Abraham in Genesis 18. So God reveals his intentions about Sodom to Abraham, which generates Abraham's bold upbraiding of God about doing what's right, followed by God's agreement to spare the city for the sake of 50. Abraham speaks 5 more times in that chapter as he brings the number down, and each time God agrees. Finally, we have Genesis 22, where God speaks twice at the beginning of the narrative, and twice more through an angel from heaven. And in all this, Abraham says only one word, Hineni, on 2 occasions. What is the nature of the God that Abraham is coming to know? In all of the reported dialogues between Yahweh and Abraham, Yahweh is shown as a God who listens to his servant and tries to address his servant's articulated needs, and in the case of God's rescue of Lot, even his unarticulated needs. So one way to think of this relational narrative arc is that it has to do with Abraham coming to understand the nature and character of the God who called him out of Haran. And the sign of Abraham's growing or diminishing discernment of God's character is his willingness to speak up in the manner of the psalmists and the prophets, articulating his own needs and interceding on behalf of others. This makes sense of Genesis 18, and it shows how this episode sets us up for Genesis 22. So let's reflect a little more on what goes on in Genesis 18. Yahweh muses to himself, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" That is concerning the city of Sodom, because the cry of Sodom has come to him. And Yahweh decides to inform Abraham of this cry in order that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh, doing righteousness and justice. So God tells Abraham he's going down to see if the cry he's heard from Sodom demands judgment. If not, I'll know, says God. But Abraham overinterprets this to mean God has already decided to destroy the city where Lot is living. No doubt that's partly due to the reputation of Sodom. It's mentioned both in chapters 13 and 14 as a wicked place, but it's probably due also to Abraham's assumptions about the character of God and what constitutes God's righteousness and justice. But notice, this is precisely what God wants to teach Abraham about by revealing his intentions about Sodom. God wants Abraham to be able to instruct his children and household in the way of Yahweh, so they will do righteousness and justice. This means that Abraham must first himself be instructed in God's righteous ways. Now, Abraham does in fact vigorously intercede on Sodom's behalf, upbraiding God for unjustly planning to destroy the righteous or the innocent with the wicked. He challenges God despite being, as he puts it, merely dust and ashes. In a series of requests that God save the city, initially for the sake of 50 righteous, he eventually ratchets this down to 10 as his last offer, he says. Abraham tests the extent of God's mercy. God accepts every request he makes. So contrary to the traditional reading of this passage, there's no bargaining or haggling going on here, because bargaining involves two people who start at opposite ends and meet in the middle. So the dialogue of Genesis 18 is different. Abraham makes an opening offer of 50. God says, sure. Abraham says, how about 45? God says, fine. Abraham proposes 40. God agrees. Then Abraham, who's getting confident now, drops the price by 10 instead of 5 and says, how about 30? God says, let's do it. Abraham then offers God 20. God agrees. Then Abraham says, I only have one final offer. How about 10? God says, yeah, 10 it is. The question is, what is God trying to teach Abraham about the way of Yahweh from this exchange? If you were overhearing a used car sale there, I think you would figure the seller was trying to give the car away. Why didn't Abraham just ask, could you save the city for the sake of Lot? Why didn't he do that? What sort of righteousness and justice does God display to Abraham in this teaching moment? One infused with mercy. I think Yahweh was looking for an excuse to save Sodom and Lot. Now, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 5, verse 1, God tells Jeremiah to go and search among the streets of Jerusalem to find one righteous person. Because if he finds one righteous person, he would not destroy the city. How many? One. But Abraham stops at. This suggests that he has not fully plumbed the depths of divine mercy. He's not yet learned what God wanted to teach him. Nevertheless, God rescues Lot and his family through the agency of angels, though Abraham hadn't thought to ask for that. There's one interesting point during the rescue operation when Lot was lingering in Sodom. The angels, quote, seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, Yahweh being merciful to him, and brought him outside the city. That's mercy, to save him. When the angels instruct Lot, okay, now flee to the hills, he says, we can't make it that far. So he appeals to their favor, or their mercy, the word is chesed, and he says, can I get refuge in that outlying town? Maybe you could not destroy it, so we could take refuge there. The angels say, sure. Lot just asked on a smaller scale for what Abraham was trying to ask for, and it was granted immediately. So the question arises is why Abraham did not simply ask God to spare Sodom for the sake of Lot and his family. And I could do a psychological reading of what it's like to ask on behalf of something very close to you. We often are resistant. We can ask on behalf of others easier. But I think ultimately he did not think God was that merciful. It had to do with his view of God. At any rate, at the end of the dialogue with God in chapter 18, Abraham has not quite learned what God wanted to teach him, even though Lot and his family are saved. It's actually not even clear that Abraham knows they've been saved. The narrative doesn't tell us this. After all, they didn't have cell phones. Lot, hey, you guys okay? I didn't get a good signal here, but yeah, we're fine. No, there's no knowledge that he's saved. All we're told is that Abraham watched from afar the smoke rising from the plain, perhaps with a sinking feeling in his stomach. So I can frame the question that wends its way through the Abraham story this way. How will Abraham be able to distinguish this God he's coming to know from the gods of the nations? And concerning the specific instructions he receives in Genesis 22, let's put the question more pointedly. Is the God of Abraham simply one of the pagan deities of Mesopotamia or Canaan who requires child sacrifice as a symbol of allegiance? Or is he a different God, a God of mercy and love for his children, who was willing to forego judgment on Sodom for the sake of the righteous? That was something Abraham should have learned in chapter 18, so he could pass it on to his children, but he didn't. The lesson was cut short by Abraham himself. So here's my hypothesis. In a final climactic episode in the Abraham story, God gives Abraham another opportunity to grow in the relationship. But God ups the ante this time. God raises the stakes. It's not his nephew Lot who'll be destroyed, along with Sodom, where he lives. It's Abraham's own son. And it's not God who will do it. Abraham must do it by his own hand. If anything would force Abraham to speak out and appeal to God for mercy, that would be it. He has the opportunity in this test to protest the command and intercede for his son's life, which would articulate his view of the character of God, both in what he says to God and by the fact that he says it. And that would show his love for Isaac too, which would be a good thing, not an impediment to his commitment to God. But Abraham doesn't speak out. He's silent. Whereas Abraham became silent at the end of his intercession in chapter 18, he stopped the conversation earlier than he needed to be, so he never fully grasped the wideness of God's mercy. Here in Genesis 22, he never gets the conversation off the ground. He's simply silent, apart from that word, hineni. And this silence speaks volumes. It articulates a view of God as clearly as if he'd used words. I would suggest that Abraham's silence speaks of a God as a harsh taskmaster who is not to be challenged. And if that's what Abraham learned about God, I wonder what he passed on to his son Isaac. He's supposed to teach his children the way of the Lord. What did he teach Isaac? So earlier I noticed that Isaac is not reported as coming down the mountain with Abraham. Would you go home with a father who just tried to sacrifice you to his God? Indeed, if you search the remainder of the Abraham story, you will find that Abraham and Isaac never see or speak to each other again after Genesis 22. And some people objected, well, they're not portrayed as speaking to each other before either very much, so that's nothing. But you know what? If you follow the geographical references in the book of Genesis, they are not even living in the same place. When Abraham sends a servant to bring a wife, Rebekah, for Isaac, when Isaac comes to greet his wife, he comes from the Negev, in the southernmost extremity of the land where he's been living. But Abraham's been living in Beersheba. They're not in the same place. And if I had time, I'd go into the fact that Sarah is living in Hebron, and Hagar is living in Beersheba. Interesting. And then where Ishmael is living, they're scattered and they're broken. Right? So it's interesting that Sarah is missing at the start of Genesis 22, but she's also missing for the rest of Abraham's life. The next time Sarah is mentioned, we're told of her death in Hebron, where she'd been living, and Abraham travels from Beersheba to Hebron to bury her. They're not living together, folks. Did Abraham's attempt to sacrifice Isaac result also in Sarah's alienation? The point is that Abraham's family life is in tatters, and by the end of the Moriah episode, these dysfunctional family members are all scattered. Is that what God wants? Is that what faithfulness to God leads to? So if God wants Abraham to instruct his children and household in God's way of righteousness and justice, let's ask, what did Isaac learn from this episode on the mountain in Genesis 22? The fact that Abraham comes down alone and isn't recorded as seeing Isaac prompts me to wonder if Abraham's attempt to sacrifice his son without even standing up for him to God and protesting didn't have the effect of traumatizing Isaac and alienating him from his father. I think it's pretty clear they're alienated from each other, but there is more going on there. So what was it like for Isaac as his father trusses him up like a sheep for slaughter, he binds him, then picks up the knife? The Hebrew word is ma'achelet. That is no ordinary knife. That is a butcher cleaver. And the boy lies there watching while Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son, only to be stopped by a voice from heaven. Abraham! Abraham! His name is repeated as if the angel is desperate to stop him, and Isaac's life is spared. Not as far as Isaac knows because of his father. He tried to kill him. The angel stopped him, who forbade him. Don't do anything to him, the angel said. So I can safely say, I think, that if Isaac learned anything of the mercy of God, it was through the angel's intervention. But if he learned it was God who commanded his father to sacrifice him in the first place, that sense of mercy would have been not unvarnished and pure. Minimally, I think Isaac would be pretty confused about who God was. And if Abraham's response to God's command did affect Isaac negatively, how could we view his response as exemplary? Wouldn't there be some other way to be faithful to God without traumatizing and alienating your son? Later we're told by Abraham's servant and by the narrator that Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, probably as compensation for what he went through on the mountain, though Isaac was not living in the same place when he gave it to him, probably through the servant. But it's interesting that Abraham never blesses Isaac. It was literally impossible to do because they were not living in the same place. So we're told that God blessed Isaac. Isn't that interesting in chapter 25? God picked up the slack and made up for Abraham's failing. But could it really make up for Abraham's failing? What would be the effect on Isaac of the estrangement and the result, the lack of direct blessing by his father? This makes me wonder if the lack of father-son blessing led to Isaac's later hyper-focus on the need to bless Esau, his firstborn, before he dies. He desperately wants to get the blessing right in the case of his own son, but he fails because Jacob, as we know, through deception, receives the blessing instead. And both Esau and Isaac are distraught that there's no blessing left for the firstborn. Perhaps it's too obvious, but then I wonder about the evident dysfunction in Isaac's family. Could this be traced back to the trauma of what happened on the mountain? Isaac and Rebekah play favorites. Jacob, with his mother's guidance, deceives his father and brother. Esau wants to kill Jacob, so he has to flee for his life. Then Jacob's children, the children of Israel, by 2 wives and 2 concubines, won't comment on that, are wildly dysfunctional. The young Joseph boasts of dreams of dominance in front of his older brothers, who then plot to kill him and sell him into slavery and deceive their father to thinking he's dead. And of course, God worked it out for good, or so Joseph says, and I believe it. But that doesn't excuse the sub-ethical, destructive behavior of Joseph's brothers, or the prideful, boastful young Joseph. This is so far from Abraham's offspring learning the way of Yahweh that it's pretty clear something has broken down in the family system. But one of the most pronounced effects of the Mount Moriah episode is the structure of the book of Genesis itself. We're all familiar with the promises given to the 3 ancestors of Israel, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That triad goes over and over again throughout the Bible. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when you stop and look at the book of Genesis, after the first 11 chapters, the universal or primeval history, you get the ancestral history starting in chapter 12. And there is, first of all, the Abraham story, chapters 12 to 25, the Jacob story, chapters 25 to 35, and the Joseph story, chapters 37 to 50. There is no Isaac story. There is only one chapter devoted to Isaac, chapter 26. Apart from that, he is a bit player in either Abraham's story or Jacob's story. And after the episode of the blessing that goes astray with his sons, he is not mentioned again until his death notice. He doesn't even show up in the story of his sons after that. He has no significant story of his own. Isaac has no actions that advance the narrative of promise. He is a much diminished, shadowy, and insubstantial character in Genesis. And maybe that's to be expected, given what he went through on the mountain. One of the most intriguing bits of information we're given that bears on the question of what Isaac learned from the events of Genesis 22 is found in chapter 31. In Jacob's conversation with his uncle Laban, which leads to a covenant between them. Jacob first affirms that despite Laban's underhandedness, the God of his fathers has protected him. And who is this God? He is, in Jacob's words, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. And then when he and Laban swear the covenant oath, we're told Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. If you want to read a fantastic novel, read the book called Son of Laughter by Frederick Buechner. It's Jacob telling the story of his family life. And every time Jacob refers to God, he calls him the fair in the whole book. That's what Isaac passed down to Jacob, by intent or otherwise, about the character of God. He's the fair. And my contextual reading of the Akedah suggests that this use of the term fear does not have primarily a positive connotation. This God is to be feared, to be afraid of, because he tells you to kill your son. That's Abraham's legacy. Now, I really don't want to condemn Abraham. I often try to imagine what emotions were going on inside of him. He may have had genuine concern for his son, mixed with anxiety and dread, and maybe even some anger and outrage at God for requiring this, following by maybe a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach that he really had no options, no recourse, because he didn't actually understand the character of God. And in the end, after all the turmoil within, he just may have been resigned to his fate. Or did he genuinely trust God, that God had some way out of this terrible situation? I wish with all my heart that he did, but I don't know. I know the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, says Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead, which is, of course, a retrojection. They didn't believe in resurrection until centuries later. But maybe he trusted in God enough that God could bring some resolution to this. How, we don't know. I hope so. I want to think the best of Abraham. I certainly don't want to question his motives. After all, who can know motives? But I have to question his actions and his lack of speech. Because if Abraham genuinely trusted God, the way he expressed his trust resulted in the estrangement and diminishment of his son. So it could not have been optimal. This suggests there must be a more excellent way than unquestioning silent obedience. In the lecture I'm going to give tomorrow, I'm going to focus on Job, who, like Abraham, is said to be a God-fearer. Of the 5 times that phrase is used, most of the times occur in the book of Job, and it describes Job. But Job's fear or reverence for God does not prevent him from bringing his lament to God in explicit verbal protest. And at the end of the book of Job, God validates Job's lament as right speech. It turns out there are a number of intertextual links between Abraham and Job. Even besides the term God-fearer, they're both God-fearers. One is the Israelite patriarch, one is sort of the Gentile patriarch, if you will. And these links, which I'm going to touch on tomorrow to some extent, but I can't touch on them all. There are too many. There are that many connections between Abraham and Job. These links suggest that the book of Job may well have been intended as an answer to Abraham's silence. You think that's a God-fearer who does what's right by being silent in his obedience? Here's another God-fearer who protests and is judged to be righteous by God. Whereas Abraham lost his voice and his son, Job found his voice after a time of silence and received new children from God, including daughters whom he cherished as much as sons, we're told. And then there's the most important link between Abraham and Job. It's the phrase dust and ashes. Do you know that phrase occurs in the Bible only 3 times, and it's on the lips of Abraham and Job. When Abraham pressed this case with God in Genesis 18, he said, I'm going to keep doing it despite being just dust and ashes. And Job at one point says, you've cast me into the dust and ashes. And it's a negative phrase. But by the end of the book, in chapter 42, Job confesses that he is, and I think this is the best translation, he is comforted about dust and ashes. Why is he comforted? Because despite being just dust and ashes, he has been heard by Yahweh, the creator of the universe, who took his lament seriously. But more about Job tomorrow. Now we're going to have some questions on Abraham. Thank you.